It's like I can see the shadows of his soul in this piece. Goodness, Clive, it's so artistic. But how does it compare to his former works? Well, I dare say, Jensen, there's one thing I'm positively, absolutely certain of. Whether 'tis nobler to perceive this piece of art from the right or the left, that is the question. It is bustling with creative energy, I'd say. Such deep, profound, meaningful art. There's just so much of himself I see pouring through this particular work. It's so deep and altruistically inquisitive. So what is creative nonfiction anyway? And exactly how pretentious do we have to be to write it? So over at the Pearl, I have a new project going with one of my apprentices, Lucy Grayku, and she is launching a print literary magazine called The Abalone. And for this literary magazine, we are seeking the best creative nonfiction in the land. And that prompts an important question that we've heard a lot over the past week or so. What the heck is creative nonfiction? Well, the answer is surprisingly simple. Creative nonfiction, sometimes called CNF, is true things told with the sensibilities of fiction storytelling. It's actually really appropriately named. At its core, creative nonfiction is simply nonfiction that is creative. So in most CNF, there will be true things, there will be real events and information, but it's communicated in the context of story, and it's told in an artistic and entertaining way. Creative nonfiction can just be a true story that you tell, like a memoir or an autobiography or a story about your uncle, as long as you tell it in an entertaining or a compelling way. Now, in some ways, you might think that this is similar to journalism. However, the difference is that journalism is supposed to be objective. It is supposed to prioritize accurately communicating the information. You know, being interesting is still important to a journalist, but ultimately it's secondary. Creative nonfiction flips it around. Our priority when we write creative nonfiction is to be interesting, to have the interesting communication of information. And while it's still important to be accurate, that is secondary. A journalist's job is to remove his personality and objectively report the facts. You might not get that impression from today's journalism, but nonetheless, that is the goal. The goal of a journalist is to take themselves out of the story, objectively report the facts so that you can make up your own mind about what this means. However, for a creative nonfiction writer, your job is to bring as much of your personality into the piece as you can. Your goal is to invite the reader in to subjectively experience something with you. You want them to feel this thing more than they just get the information of it. So the ingredients of journalism and creative nonfiction are the same. However, it's a matter of shifting the priority. Years ago, I published a creative nonfiction story called On Wilson. It was in Best of Ohio Short Stories, Volume 1. And at the time, I lived in this really rough inner city neighborhood in Columbus. And I was driving with my wife and my infant son at the time, and some kids in the neighborhood yelled some really nasty stuff at us, just for no reason, just as we were driving by. So in this story, I tell what I wanted to do at that time, and I tell it as if I actually did it. And the things that I wanted to do were not very nice, pleasant things. They're pretty violent things that I wanted to do to respond to this incident. And so I tell the story as if I got out of the car and I did these really violent, terrible things. But then the story rewinds and I tell what I actually did, which was nothing. I was quiet and I continued to drive my car. So the events are real. The information is accurate, but I've also embedded some stuff from my imagination that makes the story more interesting. So when I say that CNF is true things told with the sensibilities of fiction, that should lead us to ask the question, well, what are the sensibilities of fiction? Well, when you're writing a fiction story, you use tools like dialogue, plot, character development, scene building, complex imagery, and poetic language in order to make it compelling and interesting. So creative nonfiction itself can take a lot of different forms. We could even take an interview and turn it into a creative nonfiction piece. So sometimes you'll read an interview in a newspaper or a magazine, and from a journalistic perspective that values objectivity, we present a question and then an answer, a question and then an answer. However, when we apply this lens of creative nonfiction, now our job is to tell a story about the interview. Our job is to not just communicate the information from this interview, but to tell it in an entertaining and creative way. So I might start a creative nonfiction piece that is really an interview, something like this. It was raining on the way to the coffee shop that morning. I could feel the sloppy wet between the toes inside of my ancient Chuck Taylors as I sat down across from Tony. And instead of just a regular Q&A format, a CNF piece might add in extra story, extra content, stuff from my imagination. So I might say something like, as Tony rambled on about blood transfusions, my thoughts turned to my aunt, and I imagined her there in her leather chair at the kidney center, tubes trailing down her arms, and I thought back to the first time I saw her that way. So of course, this is not content from the interview, this is content from something else that I am now drawing in. Just like in a fiction story, the protagonist of a creative nonfiction story will usually experience some kind of dynamic shift. That means that the character changes in some way through the course of the story. So to continue our example from the interview, I might end it, the sun came out as I left the interview. I wasn't ready to be a blood donor yet, but I pulled out my phone. Still need a ride to your transfusions? I texted my aunt. I could do Tuesday mornings if it's helpful. And so there you can see that this character, theoretically me in this case, has experienced some change of mind through the course of this piece, just like we would expect to happen in a fiction story. You could also write an essay as a creative nonfiction piece. However, instead of just trying to convince someone to believe your politics or your theology, you would use a true story to drive the piece. Maybe you tell them how you came to your belief or an event that really changed your perspective. Your intent may still be to persuade your reader to agree with you, but nonetheless, you're building scenes, you're developing characters, and you're using developed conflicts to get your reader there. And these are just a couple of examples. Really, CNF is a wide open box. As long as the piece is 1, rooted in story, 2, mostly true, and 3, told in an interesting way, you're probably on the right track. CNF tends to feel like literary fiction. It usually features beautiful prose and deep thoughts, but it doesn't have to. CNF often has a first-person narrator telling his own perspective, but it doesn't have to do that either. As long as there's a story to it, what you're saying is mostly true, even if it embeds pieces that are just your imagination, and if it's interesting to read, then it's probably creative nonfiction. Now, some of my favorite examples of creative nonfiction books are Blue Like Jazz, which is by Donald Miller. He uses stories from his own life to explore fundamental truths of evangelical Christianity. Because of the way it's told, it feels almost subversive and countercultural, even though he's exploring pretty regular ideas. I also like Every Bush of Fire. This is an author that I worked with to help him bring this book to life. Kyle Peters uses stories, including his imagination, for devotionals. The reader is encouraged to explore and challenge their own faith as we read Kyle vulnerably sharing his own journey. I also love What is the What by Dave Eggers. Dave Eggers tells the story of real Sudanese immigrant children who were displaced by the Sudanese Civil War. But he does it in a way that's creative, compelling, and original. So he braids the timelines of the immigrants as children wandering through the wilderness in Sudan with their experience as adults moving to 20th century America. And it brings so much depth and also creates a narrative arc out of a story that would otherwise be really hard to read because it's so graphic and draining. Even things like Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point or Abigail Shire's Bad Therapy could be considered creative nonfiction. Now, these books are mostly informational in nature. That's why we read them. There's obviously a point to them that the author is trying to make, but nonetheless, the information is presented using a story framework. In fact, I would argue that that is what has made Malcolm Gladwell so darn successful. For some great examples of short form CNF, like essays and short stories, I really like McSweeney's. which you can check out at mcsweeneys.net, and it's mostly secular humor, so proceed with caution. Long and short of this, what is creative nonfiction? Well, surprise, it's nonfiction that is creative. CNF talks about things that are mostly true, but it uses techniques and mechanisms that we usually associate with fiction storytelling. It's not just about informing you or persuading you, but the CNF piece is about the experience you have getting there. More than anything else, be creative with creative nonfiction. I mean, it's right there in the term. Break the box. There actually are no rules, and being quirky or inventive is part of the genre. As genres go, creative nonfiction probably has the most tolerance for you to do something totally off the wall that nobody has ever done before. So if there's an element of truth to what you're telling, and if it feels like a story, and if it's fun or compelling to read, chances are you are already nailing it. Hey, so stay tuned for part 2, where I'm going to give you some specific techniques to create great creative nonfiction. Maybe you could even submit something to this new project that the Pearl has going on. And also, if you want to talk about writing every day, check out writers.company. I'd love to have you come to Cambridge, Ohio, and become one of my apprentices.